In the mid-1980s, I was living in New York City, driving a taxi for a living, trying to get published without any success. One day, in the autumn of 1986, 1987, I picked up a man. He was a middle-aged man moving into old age. He approached the taxi from behind when I didn't have the doors locked. By then I had developed the habit of locking the doors between customers, but this time I'd had a lapse in my security regimen, and he climbed in from behind. All I could see of him was his face and hear his voice. He had a lovely voice. It was cultured and soft and articulate, not bossy. It sounded very kind to me, his voice. And he said, well, let's go up the FDR. I've got to decide exactly what our destination is, but we'll head up the FDR and then I'll figure it out. I said, fine. I liked him. I trusted him. I believed him. I didn't think he was going to reach through the partition with a knife and put it to my throat, as it happened to a number of drivers at my fleet. He sounded like someone I would like to know. So I was pleased to get on the FDR, the fast highway up the east side of Manhattan. I picked this gentleman up downtown in the East Village, so it was near the FDR, not hard to get to. And as we were going uptown, he began to talk to me about this and that, especially about his war experiences in World War II. He was old enough that seemed to fit with his age, that he could well have been in World War II. He was in the Army, he said, and he had become friends, even though he was just a common private, just a basic soldier. He'd become friends with General Patton. And even though General George Patton, had this reputation for being a real hard ass and a tough guy in his high, like horse riding boots, he had been friendly with this man, and they had become friends. He'd had a good experience with George Patton during the war. I asked him if he had known any other officers, any other high officials during the war, and it turned out he had known General Douglas MacArthur. Well, this kind of failed to tally for me because I wasn't very strong on history, but I had this feeling that MacArthur had been in the Pacific. Patton had been in Europe, all right, where this man had been. But it seemed unlikely that one private would have served both in the European theater and the Far East, where MacArthur had served. I shall return and all that. Wasn't that the Philippines? Anyway, I was just as charmed as I had been with this man's demeanor. He had a wonderful face. I kept watching him in a rear view mirror. It was a very kind face with lovely lines around his eyes. It was a very trustworthy face. And yet I was starting to wonder when he brought up Douglas MacArthur and then moved almost seamlessly into talking about the Chrysler family in Detroit, I believe, and how he had known them also once he'd gotten out of the Army. It started to occur to me that maybe, although he was a very kind and caring man, my passenger was also nuts, was also delusional, was living in historical world that did exist, but only in his head. I hadn't had a good day up till that point, and a kind of calm had descended on the car once this passenger had climbed in from the rear and had started talking to me. I liked him and I wanted to stay with him and I wanted to take him wherever he wished to be deposited. And for once, my motive of making the most possible money out of a particular interchange with a passenger took on a very secondary importance. Suddenly, I just wanted us to take a kind of vacation from the harsh realities of New York life. I said to him, "Where is it you would most like to go?" You say up the FDR, but where from there? And he said, "Well, that's simple. I'd like to go to Huntington." Huntington, I said. "Where's that?" And he said, "Oh, it's out on Long Island. You don't want to go there." I said, "Well, why do you want to go to Huntington?" He said, "Because my mother's there, and tomorrow's Thanksgiving, and if you drove me out there tonight, I could stay overnight. She lives with my brother in Huntington, my brother and his wife. If you drove me out there now, I could spend Thanksgiving with them tomorrow, share their Thanksgiving meal. I haven't seen my mother in a long time. I'd love to see her. She's getting old. I'm getting old. She'd love to see me." And I said, "Well, how far is Huntington?" He said, "Oh, it's about 50 miles out on the island. It's on the north shore of Long Island. It's pretty far out. You don't want to go there." I said, "Well, maybe I do. I mean, you'd have to pay me. Do you have the cash to pay me to go to Huntington?" And as we drove, I took out my rate book, my driver's guide with rates, and on page 33, I think it was. Yeah, here, page 33, here's Huntington in Suffolk County, 36 miles. That's from Columbus Circle in Manhattan. That's ground zero for the mileage for taxi drivers. 36 miles to Huntington, and the rate, since it's out of the 5 boroughs, there's a flat fee I would charge. It's based on the rate of $2.75 a mile. So 36 times $2.75 came out to $99. I said, "Well, my rate book says you'd have to pay me $99 to go out to Huntington. Do you have that much in cash?" And he laughed and said, "I don't have any cash, but my brother has money and he'll pay you. He's doing quite well, my brother. He'd be happy to pay you." I said, "Okay, let's go to Huntington. You can see your mother then. You can have a good Thanksgiving." And on we drove, up the FDR, which is a high-speed road, as I said, for New York City. For most places, it's a bockety kind of pothole-strewn place, or was in those days. In the 80s, I'm sure they fixed it up entirely by now. But in the 80s, it was kind of a mess, and you could go 50 tops on the FDR and be comfortable in one of these spring-sprung yellow taxis I drove, because I was always granted one of the older taxis in the fleet because I was a young guy in my 30s. I was just a short-termer, as they saw it, the dispatchers. And I didn't bribe enough for them to give me a better car. That was the supposition. If you bribed $10 a day, you'd get a better car than the $2 a day most of us bribed the dispatcher. But that's another whole seamy topic. And I wasn't feeling put upon. Now we were going up the FDR. It was a nice sunny evening. Dusk was falling over the city. Headlights were coming up on cars. Life was good. I said, now, it's your choice how we go to Huntington. There's a number of ways we could go. My rate book tells me we should take 495. I believe that's the Long Island Express. Yes, it is, he said. That's the LIE, 495. We'll get on that eventually. But how we get there, what do you think? I said, well, we could take the 59th Street Bridge and go out Northern Boulevard. That's one way. That would take a while. It's city traffic, but it would avoid paying the toll going over the Triborough. We've already left the Midtown Tunnel far behind us. Now, that would have made the most sense to take the tunnel. When you leave the tunnel, that feeds you straight onto the LIE, of course. And that would have been most direct, but we've kind of put that behind us by going up the FDR. He said, that's all right. I don't like tunnels. Okay, fine, I said. Is that due to your experiences in the Army? Yes. The Army changes people. War is a brutal experience and it changes people. It changed George Patton, He was a very nice guy at the start of the war. By the time he died, late in the war, when was it, 1945? I said, I really don't know. I was born in 1949. I wasn't in the war. He said, by the time he died in that car accident, he was a mean bastard. He wasn't nice to me anymore, but he had been very nice early in the war, which goes to show you what I'm talking about. I said, it certainly does. And on we drove. So we passed up the 59th Street Bridge because he said he preferred to take the Triborough Bridge, which meant going way up the side of Manhattan, going looping around, which is lovely for a cab driver and mileage, and paying a toll. I think it was $3.50 in those days to get over the Triborough Bridge. And the bridge went back down around. Then we got on the BQE, the Brooklyn Queens Expressway. Then we got on the Grand Central Parkway, and that brought us down to the Corona Park section of Queens, where we took a left turn, in effect, and headed northwest out on the LIE, the Long Island Expressway. And by this time, we were the best of friends. I didn't have to step on it to suit this guy. He was happy just to ride and talk. He listened, but mostly he talked. And I think he liked the fact that he knew I was listening to him. Because maybe not everybody listened to him beyond a certain point. I listened to him, and I was not judgmental. I didn't say to him, you've got to be loony, Mac. This can't all be true. General MacArthur was in the Pacific, and you're blowing smoke, and I don't buy it. Because I was so pleased to be in his company. And what I did, not for a living, but what I did to give myself satisfaction in those days, as now, at this moment, is I told stories. But in those days, I wrote them down and I called them novels. I worked on them for years and years. I revised them over and over and over. I submitted them to agents. I submitted them to publishers, and they rejected them. One agent after another, one editor after another. It had gone on for decades at this point. It seemed like it anyway. I was only in my 30s. It hadn't gone on for decades until I reached my 40s. However, it seemed like it had been about 30 or 40 years of rejection. Rough times in New York. When I thought about this guy in the back seat, it occurred to me that he must have had rough times too. They were unspecified, but how did he live if he couldn't hold down a job because he was delusional, even though he was very nice, had a beautiful face? I was starting to look a little closer at him in the mirror now, and I noticed his collar was frayed, and his clothes perhaps were not as clean as they might have been. I hadn't noticed any of this at first, when he had let himself in the back door from behind me. I couldn't see his shoes. For all I knew, he didn't have shoes. He had just climbed in quite quietly and with good demeanor into the cab and started speaking softly to me. A nice guy. I liked him. And I liked stories. And he and I and the taxi and Huntington, Long Island, felt like we were all turning into a story together. So I thought, well, what are a few hours out of my life? What's 100 miles? Or 36 times 2, what are 72 miles out of my life? In a given 12-hour shift, I tended to drive 200 miles. What were 72 miles to donate in exchange for getting a story? So on we drove. I said, now, you have to know how to get me to your brother's house in Huntington. Do you have the address? And he said, I don't have it written down, but I can find it. I've been there before many times, and I can find it. Don't worry. It's exit 49N from the LIE. And then we go up. I think I'll know the number of the highway when we get there, but we go north from there towards Long Island Sound. And sure enough, we got to 49N, and the sign said Huntington, South Huntington, on Highway 110. He told me that. He told me the highway number was 110, but I'd already seen the highway sign myself, so I knew the highway number was 110. But when we got to Huntington, and all this had taken maybe an hour, I think a little less than an hour, even though it had started at the end of rush hour, didn't take too long. When we got to Huntington, he knew the turns, and he fetched us up to this one address in a suburban area of this town of Huntington, Long Island, which seemed like a middle-class neighborhood, nothing fancy, a suburban house. He said, wait just a moment. Wait right here. I'll go knock on the door. My mother will be so happy to see me. And my brother will pay for this. I'll get the money from him and come pay you. So I said, fine. Take your time. He left the taxi. He walked up the steps to the front door. He buzzed the buzzer. A man opened the door and gaped at him. And he said, God damn it, George. I told you not to do this again. The last time you did this, it cost me $150 to take care of. Why? And went on and on, bad-mouthing this nice man, his brother. I sat there listening. I had the windows open. I could hear it all. George, for that was his name, like General George Patton. George didn't say much. He had a mild, rather sweet voice, and he was standing with his back to me. I couldn't hear what he was saying to his brother. I could hear a woman's voice in the background. It was not the voice of an old woman. It was not the voice of their mother. I could tell that. It was the semi-hysterical voice, I surmised, of the wife of George's brother, the man who was going to pay me for this escapade, this developing story. Finally, I decided I needed a closer venue for observing this drama. I got out of the taxi. I walked up to where George was standing, still outside the house. His brother had not let him in the door. And very mildly, myself, I said, hello, George told me that you'd be happy to pay for the fare for bringing him out here. And it was on that basis that I brought him, so I need to be paid now, please. The brother fussed and fumed. He had smoke coming out of his ears and maybe other orifices I couldn't see. He was upset. He chose not to respond to my polite entreaty for money, but his wife did respond. She was shrieking her own imprecations from inside the house, cursing me, cursing George, and saying it was time they called the cops. To which her husband said, "That didn't work last time. We could try it. If you really want to, I can't stop you." And now I heard George say, all I really want is to see Mom. Can't you wake her up and let me talk to her for a few minutes? I was hoping to spend Thanksgiving with her. "Oh, Thanksgiving," said the man. "You are not spending Thanksgiving with us. Don't you remember that Christmas that time? You nearly broke her heart. We got you that apartment in Manhattan. That's what that's for. It's for you to stay there and not come out here anymore." George didn't look particularly downcast when he heard this rejection. I, an expert on rejection, was sympathetic to seeing him be rejected. So I waited to see how it would play out. The brother was exasperated, but deflated. He had lost his initial dose of energy. His wife, however, was gathering an increased amount of rage inside the house. I could hear her carrying on. She was shouting at me that I had to remove George from their premises. It was my fault, she said. I said, "Now, lady, really, that's unfair. I'm a New York City cab driver, and the rules specify I must take anyone who gets into my taxi wherever they want to be taken. Those are the rules. That's the law." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't say they were being cruel to George not to allow him to spend Thanksgiving with his mother, even if Christmas might not have gone so well. I didn't add any more. I'd made my position clear. Although I did say, just to be lawyer-like myself, I did add the one small bit that if I had been brought out there under false pretenses, namely that I would be paid for the service rendered to George, that would be considered, in a court of law, that would be considered theft of services. That's what we called it, we cab drivers. Theft of services, when someone ran out on a fare, as they were running out on George's fare. "We are not," she shrieked. "We're not running out on it. You're going to run out of here right now." And so on. And then she did a about face and went off to call the police. So she said. I wasn't sure that was actually what she was doing until the police arrived. The Huntington police, not New York police. These were polite Huntington police. They clearly hated this sort of domestic call, getting mixed up in a family disturbance. Why wouldn't they hate it? They didn't arrive with the siren going. They arrived slowly, regretfully. Their job was to cool things down. But they were just young kids. I was in my late 30s. They seemed like young kids to me. Tall, strapping lads, but kids. They didn't want to be embroiled in this mess. George and his brother and sister-in-law. I was back in the taxi by then. They talked to me first. I had the feeling they wanted to put off talking to the central characters as long as they could in hopes of a family miracle. I explained the situation as I saw it, and one of them did grow a little irked with me. He said, "Why the hell did you bring the guy out here?" I said, "Officer, this is how it works in New York City. Someone gets into my taxi, I have to take them where he wants to go. I can't lock the doors and lock him out," which I frequently did, actually, but not legally. And I neglected to that time. That was why George had been able to climb in, approaching me from the rear. But I was glad he had now. I would be breaking the law, and New York cops would give me a hard time if I failed to do my duty and transport this customer where he wanted to go. Oh, is that right? Said the kid. And he backed off because it wasn't his job to malign the law, was it? They could see I was hopeless. Goody two shoes, taking a customer anywhere he wanted to go. Anyway, they went up to the front door and they tried calming things down, but it backfired. The wife only got more excited. The husband, George's brother, only got more despondent. George stood there with a kind of half smile, rather fatalistic, and he said to the two cops, he said, "I just want to see my mother. Is anything so wrong with that? Tomorrow's Thanksgiving. I like Thanksgiving. It's my favorite holiday." Oh, I could see the cops kind of liked George too. He was the most likable person there. George was. Much more likable than his brother, or the brother's wife, this shrew. The mother, I didn't know. She was presumably asleep in the house. She was an old woman. She was napping, and the brother was damned if he was going to wake her up and upset her by telling her that George was there. My guess was she loved George dearly, and that was why it would upset her to have to try to navigate the delusions of his mind as she had tried for many years. It was all becoming kind of clear, in a hazy sort of way, but kind of clear. The police, I could overhear them saying to George's brother, "Well, we're not really equipped to deal with this sort of thing. You can't commit him to us. You could commit him to social workers. We could call the social workers and have them come out, but that would take a while. And that might not work either." George's brother broke in at this point. "Hell's bells, we've been through that so many times. We've committed him. We've talked to social workers. We got him an apartment in Manhattan. He just won't stay there. He keeps coming out here. He says he wants to see Mom. He keeps doing this." And the officer shrugged. It was an intractable situation, and Thanksgiving was coming. People just wanted to sit down in peace and eat turkey and cranberry sauce, whipped cream with the pumpkin pie, whatever George wanted. They all wanted to be happy, but his mother would be so upset. George's brother was almost in tears. Now, George was pacific about it all. General George Patton had taught him well how to contain his emotions and not break down in tears when he was being insulted by family members. Or was it General George Marshall who had taught him that? He had known George Marshall also during the war. Maybe that was just after the war. There were lots of phases to George's life. He'd known many luminaries. He probably knew Ed Koch. But anyway, George knew me a little now. He and I were friends. We hadn't exchanged names or a hand clasp or anything, but we knew each other. We liked each other. I listened to their lack of negotiation going on, the insults spewing from deeper inside the house. Then I had an idea. I got back out of the taxi again. I approached the group by the front door, and I tugged at the sleeve of the one cop who seemed more reasonable. We went off to the side, and I said, "You know, it occurs to me, there might be a way out of this for all of us. And that is, I'll be willing to drive our man George back to Manhattan if his brother will pay me what he owes. It'll all be taken care of then. The mother won't have to be waked up. These people's Thanksgiving won't be ruined. I have a feeling George will take it fairly amiably if we do that. But I won't if I'm not paid. I really need to be paid. There's this thing called theft of services. The cop nodded. He knew what theft of services was. He probably had wacky cab drivers in Huntington who had accused people of theft of services. Maybe he thought I was being reasonable. He didn't seem hostile himself or unfriendly, the way a lot of New York City cops were. He seemed well adjusted for an underpaid policeman. He said, "That sounds like a fair solution. I'm going to broach that to the others. Let's see if I can get them to accept this." So he took the brother aside. He was wise enough not to bring up this deal, this solution, with the brother and the brother's wife together, because he could tell, as I could tell, that the wife seemed to relish antagonism and fighting. She had kind of come alive in the course of all this in an unfortunate way. George and his brother and the absent mother, they were going to be the victims of all this. So the cop talked with George's brother for a while. And I could see the brother thinking about it, not reacting at first, and then, with great regret, coming to the conclusion that, yes, he had to do this. He had to pay me. What did he owe me? And I said, well, if you include the fare going over the Triborough 2 ways, which I paid coming out, and I'll be paying it going back, without a tip, it would come to $106. With a tip, most people would pay me probably around $120, $125, but that's entirely up to you. George, meantime, had waked up to what was going on. He was listening too, and he was intrigued by all this. It sounded fair to him. $120. It wasn't coming out of his wallet. I could see now that George's money that didn't come from welfare agencies was coming from his brother in Huntington. Another C note to get him off the hook. So eventually he disappeared. He talked to his wife, I suppose. Maybe she was the one with the cash. This was in the days before money machines were everywhere. He came out with $120. I was astonished that he tipped me after all this. Astonished and very grateful, and I made that clear to him. You're a prince, I told him, and your brother is a prince, and I'm sure you know that. He may have an active imagination, but he's a good man. So I'll be happy to drive him back to the city now. Just tell me where I should drive him there. His brother said, he can tell you. He knows exactly where his apartment is. Good night. And in he went. To his house, to his wife, to his mother, to his Thanksgiving dinner the next day, to the bile that must have been building up in his system all through this sad encounter. But I was taking George away. Social workers wouldn't be necessary. The situation had been defused. And George and I took another route back to the city then, after saying good evening to the cops and going our way. We decided we'd take the slower route, give us a chance to talk. I said, now, George, why don't you sit up in front with me? You can see the world better from the front seat. So he did. He moved up, sat beside me. There was the the meter and all that kind of in the way, and I had to move my bag of stuff. We even put on our seat belts for the ride back into the city. Very seldom did I wear my seatbelt, but just in honor of his safety, I asked him to put his on. He was pleased to do it. And I noticed while he was putting his seatbelt on that he was wearing some quite attractive shoes. They were loafers, nice shoes. Maybe he'd gotten them at a Goodwill store. Maybe not. I didn't know. I didn't ask. If I had seen his shoes when he was approaching me, I would have welcomed him into my cab. We drove back to the city, not on the LIE, but taking back ways along the North Shore first. And then eventually we did take the LIE for the last part of the ride. But we had a good, easy-going trip back into the city. Night had fallen on Manhattan and on Long Island. George's mother slept on in the peacefulness of that little suburban house without knowing the drama she had missed. And George did know exactly where to direct me when we got back into the city. His apartment was on 13th Street, just off 2nd Avenue. Not a bad address. I wouldn't have minded having an apartment in that part of town myself. He didn't invite me up, George. I left him on the street. He said he had to buy some food at the deli so he'd have something to eat that night. We parted best of friends. I said to him, you know, George Marshall was a very lucky general that he knew you during the war. And so was George Patton. I envy them knowing you during those years. Well, thank you, said George. It's very nice of you. And away he went into the deli, and off I drove into the nocturnal streets of New York, dodging the potholes, which I knew were about to appear in this lane or that, as I went on up 6th Avenue toward Central Park.